Good morning, John. It's good to see you.
Good morning. You're not gonna officially introduce me?
I am going to officially introduce you. This is
Oh,
my
okay.
brother, Jon Beard. He's getting his PhD in biology. He specializes in inhalation and toxicology and aerosols. You're currently researching vaping. Is that correct?
Yeah. There's two projects in my lab that I've taken the lead on, one of which is the effects of vaping, and the other one is the effects of 3D printing.
So, which one has been most interesting to you?
The vaping is by far more interesting, both
Hmm.
from the results we're getting and also from the conceptual material. Vaping is just, I think, a more interesting topic, and it applies to more people.
Yeah, it's super
And
popular right now, and
yeah,
that's
and
one of the reasons we're going to tackle it today.
for me too, the thing that brings me the most enjoyment when it comes to my research is having things that can be related to public health. And
Hmm.
so, 3D printing, it's important and it's becoming more popular in households, but vaping is really easy to connect with people on. And so it's like, even if I'm in a bar or something, I see someone vaping and be like, oh, like which kind of device is that? And I can open a conversation about it, which makes my research feel more fruitful.
So tell me, did you vape before you started doing research on vaping?
Yeah, I wouldn't like, I didn't necessarily, not as a habit, and I don't have my own device, but I definitely had some from other people. Yeah, at a party
I like
setting
I
or
like how you
something.
clarify not as a habit.
Right. Like I'm
You
not
did it
like
socially.
a person who vapes, or I never was someone who vaped necessarily,
Okay.
but just like if something was getting passed around just to try it. Yeah, I tried it.
Like watermelon, what'd you try? What flavor? Did you like it?
Um, I tried. Well, there was a couple of weed vapes, which is a little
Oh,
different, but
yeah, a little different.
I don't know if I ever actually tried a nicotine vape or just have been around it. Because I didn't really want to try nicotine, so
Okay, well, that's good.
um, yeah, I think I only tried the weed vape.
Oh, John.
Gotta try
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've never tried that before.
it.
So, but after and remind me again, how long have you been doing research on vaping?
A couple of years now. I joined this lab spring of 2022 and have been looking into those two topics, vaping and 3D
Okay.
printing, since then.
And would you vape again if it was like just a quick thing socially?
Well, on one hand, again, I'm not too fond of nicotine, so I've always kind of avoided that regardless of its
Hmm.
mechanism. And the weed vape, I definitely wouldn't try again.
Okay.
Yeah, I've
So
already been in like the same kind of setting, and someone did offer it, and I was like, no, I don't want that.
that's good. It's a good thing to
Yeah.
turn down. I just all I see everywhere are young. I call them young kids, but like teens, even college kind of age kids.
Mhm.
Everybody is pretty much vaping right now, and it's becoming a trend in the different flavors and the different devices. And I've even seen like some pop stars with their vapes out and everything. And so my in my head, I'm like, is this a danger or a threat to people's health and they're not realizing it? So I want to know what you've been finding in the lab.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that it's like college age kids for the most part. So when you look at CDC statistics, the 18 to 24-year-old age group is there's twice as many people who vape compared to conventional smoking in that age group. And
Hmm.
so there are more smokers overall still with cigarettes, but vaping is much more popular with the younger you go in the demographics. And
So how
um,
young do you think?
so 8 to 24 is the most prominent age group for vaping, but you do get a larger uh, discrepancy between conventional cigarette smoking and vaping if you go even younger. So high
Hmm.
school age kids and middle school age kids, there are a significant number of them who either have vaped or actively vape. And that's the biggest concern when it comes to the field of vaping. I think you asked, like, is it safe? Um, on one hand, yes, it is becoming more popular. Its safety is still not particularly well known. But the biggest concern is that it's not 30, 40-year olds, 50-year olds, maybe ex smokers who are vaping. That's not the biggest demographic. It's people who are young and, I mean, statistically, according to surveys, likely wouldn't have smoked otherwise. So it is reaching a new demographic. Smoking is
Hmm.
down highly significantly, even in the last 20 years. I mean, obviously it's way down from the 1900s, but last couple of decades, smoking has continued to significantly decrease over time.
Mm.
And this is true both based on the numbers of people vaping, based on each age group, and also even just like surveys of the appearance of smoking. Smoking has become significantly less like cool or appealing as it was in the 1900s, especially in the 90s. It's probably the end of that kind of age of smoking, and now it's seen more as a turnoff in pop culture. And even like the smell of smoking is negatively associated now
Right.
versus you said you've seen like some pop stars with vaping.
Mm.
Vaping is still considered to be cool and sleek and now the new kind of modern thing
Right.
to do. So vaping will likely continue to gain popularity over the next couple of decades. And I think probably the only thing that really would hinder it is if there are significant health effects that we discover, like we did obviously with cigarettes. Um, to kind of jump to the main conclusion that I have from vaping,
Yeah.
um, on one hand, I don't think there are as significant of health effects for vaping as there are for smoking as of right now. But the big problem is that vaping has only been around for 10 years. And if you look at, say, the correlation between cigarettes and lung cancer, there's not a better example of a positive correlation in just basic data science. I mean, that's like one of the best correlations you can see. It's a very obvious connection between cigarettes and lung cancer. And now, of course, we know that smoking cigarettes is the number one cause of lung cancer in the world. And it's actually because it's the cause of lung cancer, that's one of the number one causes of mortality
Yeah.
in the world.
And you know, it was interesting because when I was in Italy a few months ago, everybody was smoking.
Yeah,
And I was so blown away by that. I just was like, causes cancer. Like,
right.
do you not know this? Young people, old people, it was like a cultural thing. And I
Yeah,
just did not understand that. Because it seems like you said everybody knows it's a known carcinogen. It causes cancer, it causes lung cancer. It's highly addictive.
yeah.
This has been known. So I kind of was baffled by that a little bit.
Yeah, it is pretty well known, I would say, at this point, even globally. But in some cultures, like you're saying, it's still very popular, like it was for us
Mm,
30 years ago. So, even though people know the health risk, even with something as obviously dangerous as smoking, that doesn't always mean that people will stop. And that's not really even what my concern is either, right? I'm not trying to prevent people from doing things that endanger themselves if they want to, but I want them to
mm,
know what the danger is while they're doing it. I don't want them to be
100%.
naive to what they're doing.
Yeah.
So, if I saw someone smoking cigarettes, I would assume they already know that,
Yeah.
we call them cancer sticks for a reason. I assume they already know it at this point because it is so well known. But if they
Right.
happen to not, I'd be like, wait, you really have not heard? I would want to tell them, and then they
Yeah.
can make the decision at that point
But
going
I
forward.
I feel like though with vaping, like people don't know if there are any risks
Yes.
and they may
Well,
assume there may be some light ones, but they don't really care and they know it's not a cigarette. So if you're comparing like cigarettes to vaping, like are there any dangers with vaping at all? And how close does it come to cigarettes and involve and like let's compare it with the addiction factor
yeah.
too.
Okay, so now you brought up three good points. Let me first quickly wrap up what I was saying with the correlation thing.
Hmm.
Cigarettes are clearly correlated to lung cancer. But if you look at the rate of when cigarettes were becoming popular in the early 1900s and when we started having lung cancer cases, there's a 20-year discrepancy between those two
Hmm.
things. So in other words, it took 2 decades for the cancer to start being diagnosed and start being uh, it takes a while for cancer to develop in general, even if you've been
Right.
exposed to something. There's certain diseases that take a while. For example, Parkinson's disease is another obvious case where you get exposed to a chemical in your 20s, you don't see it till your 60s. Lung cancer and cancers in general is another case where if you have an environmental exposure, you won't see that for decades.
Wait, can
So,
I interject real quick? What
yeah.
is there a known link to Parkinson's? Is
Yeah,
that what you're referencing?
there are some known genetic factors for Parkinson's. There's also some known environmental factors for Parkinson's. For
Okay.
example, many veterans have Parkinson's because a lot of the chemicals that were used World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War.
Like Popo.
Now, yeah. So Paul Paul actually had a double exposure because not only was he a airplane mechanic in the Korean War, which the chemical solvents they would have used to clean the planes back then are linked to Parkinson's. Also, then he came after the war and started farming, and all those pesticides they used back then are also now known causes of Parkinson's
I
disease.
did not know that.
Yeah, so there's really no way for us to know if it was because he was a veteran of the war or because of his farming what led to his ultimate Parkinson's.
Mm.
But it almost certainly was environmental rather than genetic,
Well, he worked on planes quite a bit, you know, and
right? So
yeah,
not only
that's
are
really, really,
you
really
physically
sad
using those
that,
solvents, like you
yeah,
might not have gloves or whatever, but also you're just inhaling those fumes.
mm,
So yeah,
that's really
it's
sad.
I think I forgot the exact like a term for them, but I think organic chlorinated compounds are known causes of Parkinson's, and so a lot of those compounds were used as pesticides and as cleaning solvents in the military. So
Oh my
yeah.
goodness.
So back to smoking, even though smoking is a known cause of cancer, you might not see that. In fact, you don't see that for on average 20 years.
Mm.
So that goes back to vaping. Okay, is
Hmm.
it safer than smoking? Our current data pretty strongly says yes, vaping is safer than smoking. That being said, we don't have long-term data. Vaping has not been popular in the US, but for maybe 10 years. Um, it got introduced in the US about around 2010 and has been gaining in popularity since then. So we don't have long-term data. So even if vaping is the same factor as smoking, it would take probably 20 years for us to really know if it was causing cancer. That being said, our research is better now. We do have new genotoxicity tests, new tests of carcinogenicity. We have ways of seeing if things could cause cancer or could be genetically toxic, and we don't see that from vaping. So if it does cause cancer, we don't have reasons to think so right now. The only problem is we just can't be certain until we have long-term data.
Yeah.
Um, so what are the current known risks of vaping? I would say overall vaping, when compared to cigarettes, definitely looks a lot better. But here's the tricky thing. So I said at the beginning, one of the things that I'm most interested in is just telling people the various risk factors associated with whatever behavior might be, you know, currently being discussed. With the case of vaping, it's just not a single thing like it is with cigarettes. With cigarettes, you know exactly how much nicotine is in a certain cigarette. You know about the tars, and you
Hmm.
can easily quantify the various risk factors with cigarettes. With vaping, there's a whole host of variables, and the field of vaping is exploding well beyond what regulation can keep up with. Like, there's just no way we can test all the things that are being created for vaping. There's both the vape device, there's already 4
Hmm.
generations of e-cigarettes, and they have different, not only quantities of risk, but different sources of risk when you compare them one to another.
What do
So
you
the
mean different
kind
sources?
so, in other words, let's look at third versus fourth generation of vape devices. Fourth
Hmm.
generation of vape device is the newest one. So you can think of like Juul or Elf Bar or a Posh device. The most popular kind is a fourth generation. The one right before that, the third generation device, these are known as tank mods because they have the larger devices and they're more popular in the hobbyist crowd because they're more customizable.
These are such cool names.
Yeah, I mean the
I
pod
want
mods
one.
of fourth gen. It's easy. It fits in your hand. Yeah, it's a lot of things. It's a lot of pros in the marketing.
Yeah.
Um, the thing about the third generation is these are your open-ended devices. They cause a lot more chemical byproducts to be made during the aerosolization process. So that's
Hmm.
another thing that we'll have to talk about. What you put into a vape device is not what comes out of it because there's a chemical reaction and you get a lot more in the aerosol than when you put into the liquid. And that third gen device causes a lot more of that to be produced. So the negative effects of the things that you get from those byproducts, some of these byproducts are dangerous, like formaldehyde or acrolein,
Okay.
things that have known toxic effects. We're finding these in the vape aerosol. And there's a lot more of those in a third gen device than a fourth gen device. So in that case, it's like, oh, well, from the standpoint of these byproducts, third generation devices are worse and have those associated toxic effects at a higher quantity. But
Yeah.
then if you look at fourth generation devices, like, okay, so these are cleaner. They have less of these byproducts, which is good. But then now they're using nicotine salts. And so you have certain acids in the aerosol that you don't have with third generation devices. That has their own source of effects. And they
Hmm.
also have a higher concentration of nicotine. And so now any kind of nicotine based problems are higher in fourth gen. So it's like, which one do you want to use? You pick your poison.
Well,
And it literally is a different kind of poison in a way.
okay, so they're different poisons, but this is based on your research. So which
Yeah.
one is the worst one to pull off the shelf out of all of those? Jewel,
I,
tank, whatever.
I'm always really concerned when I see people using the refillable cartridges, which are more associated with that third generation device. Because my research in particular, I've done two things. I've done a literature review, which we have that is submitted right now, which is just looking at the general effects of vaping, the different kinds of vaping. And then my research is specifically looking at what happens if you're using a refillable coil and things go wrong. And so I know about more of the problems that can occur with the refillable, and that always gets me very alarmed. Because the things I've mentioned so far, the different things in the aerosol, which we can touch on more, the nicotine, which we'll definitely need to touch on more. So for me, the third generation devices are more concerning because not only do you have those increased chemical byproducts in the aerosol, which I just mentioned, but there are also more things that can go wrong with them, specifically with refillable cartridges. So in vaping, you have disposable cartridges and refillable cartridges. And with refillable cartridges, you can reuse the same coil over and over. The coil is the thing that heats up the e-liquid and causes it to be aerosolized. With disposables, they're one-time use, they run out of liquid, you throw them away. And so normally I would be more in the camp of, well, reusing is better, it can save you money, it can save materials, it's more environmentally friendly. But in the case of vaping, reusing the coils has some significant potential health effects. And specifically, this comes in what's known as dry hitting. And so this is something that my research specifically looks at that other labs don't do. And the reason other labs don't look at dry hitting is because according to the vape manufacturer, dry hitting is a mishandling of the device. So as a researcher, you're not supposed to do that because if you say, oh, here's this health risk from vaping, it comes from dry hitting, then reviewers can look at that and say, oh, well, you did it wrong. You're trying to fearmonger or something. This is not the way the device is supposed to be used. Which to me is ridiculous because the way that they avoid dry hitting with a refillable coil, this is the only thing with refillable coils, is I would have to pipette the exact volume, and after X amount of puffs, I refill the same volume in however many milliliters, half a mil, 1 mil, and I make sure that the volume in my coil never gets below a certain point. That's not how people vape in public. So you have the vape manufacturer saying, oh, this is wrong. And you have a problem in the scientific field right now where a lot of it is influenced by the tobacco industry. And so they can go out and attack your paper if you do something they think is like not the way the device is supposed to be used. And so we have this very real phenomenon that I think anyone who vaped, who's used one of these refillable coils knows what I'm talking about. It's like as you use it, the level of liquid gets lower. And the only way you really know if it's time to refill it is if you get that really dry hit where it like feels smoky and tastes really bad. The reason it tastes bad and feels so like smoke is because the cotton is burning. And cotton smoke is a known toxin. You're not supposed to inhale cotton smoke. That's one of the things, for example, in like with fire hazards, some people who are injured or who die from smoke inhalation is because of those things that are burning up in a fire, including cotton things. There was actually, interestingly enough, a debate when vaping was first becoming popular if the coil should use cotton wicks or hemp wicks. And I think because hemp is so demonized, especially in America, that they went with cotton instead of hemp. And I think that was a huge mistake because hemp is actually something that is kind of meant to be burned. Like it's okay to burn hemp and cotton is not.
But that's so crazy. So they did that mainly for marketing?
Yeah, it's just easier to sell. I mean, vapes, I think, as a whole, probably wouldn't have taken off if they had used hemp. It would have been demonized as like this is a smoker, this is like a weed only kind of thing, and because hemp has just been demonized since the early 1900s by the paper industry, really unfairly. So
I didn't realize cotton was dangerous like that.
It's not supposed to be burned. Plain and simple. And
so no one knows this, huh? Like when it gets down.
No, it's very, very not well known. It's certainly not well discussed. Is the problem.
So have you studied this specifically in the lab with the cotton?
Yes.
Burning?
This is one of the things that I specifically started looking at because when I was first kind of playing around with the vape device and seeing like what kind of water do I want to use, what kind of resistance to coil should I use, what liquid do I want to use in this, what do I want my ratios to be of my constituents in the liquid. One of the things that I was finding is like, oh, if I go at too high of a wattage or too low of a volume of liquid, like my coil burns out. I was like, oh, well, that's not good. And the thing that was really confusing to me for a couple of months when I was first beginning is I would do a test, I would go look at the site of toxicity, and sometimes my cells would be totally fine. Like they're completely healthy. And then the next week I would go and try to run the same kind of test and they would die out. And I was like, why? Like, what's going on here? Like, is there something wrong with my methods? I don't understand.
And can you specify like what kind of cells you're looking at?
So your alveoli are the very bottom of your pulmonary region. So because vaping, when we look at like aerosolized toxins, we look at the size of the particles. And so we have to assess how deep in the pulmonary region they can go. For example, like asbestos fibers only sit at the top of your bronchus. And so those are larger particles that don't go deep into the pulmonary system. So you wouldn't want to look at alveolar cells for that. You would want to look at more epithelial bronchial cells. But obviously vaping does go to the deepest part of the pulmonary system. The whole point of a product like vape is that it does get to the bloodstream. So of course vaping does produce very small particles that go all the way to the deepest part of the pulmonary system. So I was using A549s to look at what happens when they reach the very bottom of the lungs to those various alveoli. What kind of effect could they have on those lung cells? And so these lung cells, human alveolar lung cells, sometimes would die and sometimes wouldn't. And what I ended up discovering is, I remember one day I did my test and I took out my coil because, again, I was used to like, oh, sometimes it would blow out like the first 3 minutes and, oh, I just had not enough liquid or whatever. And then I remember at the end of one test, I took out my coil and I opened it up and the inside had burned, but it didn't burn all the way through. In other words, dry hitting isn't this thing that either occurs and your coil fails or doesn't occur and you're safe. It's more of a spectrum. And so there's a degree of dry hitting that can occur during a test like this. And so this is what people experience when they have that really like sour, bitter, nasty hit, and then they know to put more liquid in. And that's the thing that's so dangerous to me about these refillable coils. So it's like you have a really dry hit, and that tells you need to refill your coil, and then you keep using that same coil that just pyrolyzed. In other words, the cotton, it's not technically combustion. It's if it's in the liquid, it's a low oxygen environment. But that cotton is degrading. And so it's going to start releasing gas and other particles into the liquid that it wouldn't otherwise. And so people don't just have that experience and necessarily throw out the coil. Some might. I recommend you do if you're using refillable coils. But other people will just refill the liquid and keep using that same coil that's already starting to break down. And that's what I found once I actually realized what was going on with my cells. The cells that were having dry hitting in the coil were the ones that were dying. And if it didn't dry hit, if it was a saturated condition, they would stay alive. And so while there are still other kind of global health effects from vaping in the research, dry hitting is just so much worse than regular saturated vaping.
Okay, so like one time is probably, I'm just like, this is just me thinking like about it. So just one time dry hitting, okay, it's not going to affect you. But like a couple times, 10 times, 12 times, like I know you have to like have more research maybe to show, but what basically are you seeing that is so damaging to these lung cells with the dry hitting?
So it's really hard. Well, in my case, I looked at cytotoxicity, which is just my lung cells die outright. Now I'm using, an in vitro model. So it's the cells in your lungs are going to be more protected because they have a surfactant layer around them and they have immune cells and it's a more complex system. So they will be more protected. In my case, it's just the outer layer of cells by themselves.
You said they outright die, but how long does it take to reproduce those cells in the lungs?
So it's interesting. Those cells have probably a 22-hour doubling time. So in theory, after a day, they could regrow. But I look at it 24 hours after the exposure. That's when I do my cytotoxicity test to see. It's not necessarily like a chronic long-term effect, but it's not immediate. And after 24 hours is when my cells have died. And so they'll go from, instead of being 100% viability, they'll drop to be 30% of those cells are still alive. Now, I don't expect for someone to have a dry hit or even multiple dry hits and 70% of their alveolar cells to die. Again, the in vitro model is more sensitive than the cells in your lungs. But that's probably the big problem is kind of like what you're hinting at. We don't know the full effect of what one dry hit will do. It's kind of like, we don't know what effect one cigarette will do. If you smoke one cigarette, you're probably not going to get lung cancer. Now, if you start looking at these other factors they don't want you to look into in the field, you can start seeing a better picture of what the real danger is. And to me, that's more important. So even though, and this is getting into something kind of a separate issue, for example, one of my committee members is a researcher in Portland, Oregon, and he has published on dry hitting, and he got attacked online. People put out articles that he was fear mongering and intentionally
Really?
making vaping look worse. Yeah, and so that's like a risk that I'm now looking at. If I publish this paper, I think the most likely thing I publish, no one's even going to read it. That's the most likely
Well,
thing. But
yeah, but now you're on a podcast platform, Jon.
that's
I got
true.
news for you.
Yeah.
This isn't just a
The,
paper anymore.
but I already told, I mean, so he's on my committee. He kind of warned me. He's like, hey, this research is important, but, like be aware this
It
could
is
happen.
important. So you think so, and this is we don't want to get in trouble by saying anything here, but I'm just like I'm curious who came out against him specifically.
So I know there was like a pro vaping organization that said that he was making it look
A
worse than it
pro
was.
vaping organization. I'm sure they had a
There's a
pro
few
cigarette
online.
organization.
Of course, yeah, yeah. I mean, vaping is like I think more advocated for than smoking is. Smoking is again, it's so well known that it is what it is. Like but vaping is there's a lot more people who are trying to defend it. And in some cases it's fair, and then in others you have like this where it's like they're just kind of lashing out to try to defend.
Well, I mean, it's popular and it makes money.
Yeah, for sure. And it's also again it's a hobby, so there's some people who are just really passionate about it. But there's even a cartoonist who made a cartoon about him and making fun of him. And, yeah, so it's like he's like like watch out. But me, it's like first of all I kind of like controversy. I'm not afraid of it, and it's important anyway. So why not? I mean,
so why is it important to you? And like when these cells die, what's really happening over time?
Well, it's the reason why it's important to me is it's so frustrating that this dry hitting in particular, and this is only one facet of vaping. We'll get to the rest. Dry hitting is just a real thing that people are currently doing with their vape devices, and they don't know what's happening. And because now that there's a stigma and the scientific field that's researching vaping to not do it, the word's not getting out. And so to me, that's really frustrating where it's like, so I don't care if people say that dry hitting is a mishandling device and it's not like a proper research method. This is something that's actually happening and people need to know about it. And so if no one looks into it, then they're never going to know what kind of danger is being produced by it.
So we talked about the cells dying and things like that. And
the main headline there as far as I've only done one research project on it, so I don't know the full spectrum of what can happen with dry hitting, but it's cells dying. It's from the cotton wick pyrolyzing, and we are seeing some unique chemical byproducts that are only found with dry hitting. So I don't know exactly what they are. To be really specific, they're showing up from our NMR in the aromatic and alkene regions. They could be byproducts that are naturally produced from vaping. They're just produced more with dry hitting, or they could be unique because of this pyrolysis that's occurring. We don't fully know yet. But we do know there's clear biological toxicity, and we have a chemical source that could be producing that toxicity.
Okay, so with that toxicity and the cells dying, like I'm thinking like for myself, like if I were a user and I enjoyed this socially and I have my little Juul vape or whatever, and I go on the weekends to my clubs and I'm vaping, like I'm talking to you and you're a scientist, obviously, so I'm concerned, like, and I'm thinking like, well, oh my gosh, how is this affecting my lungs over the next 5 years or so? Like, what does that mean that my cells are dying? How would you explain that to me?
Yeah, and well, the problem is I don't know what it means in your lungs, right? Because your lungs are different than the cells that I use in the lab. I just know that it's something that could hurt you, and I don't know if that's something that leads to a disorder down the road in years or decades. And I don't know if it's something that your lungs filter it out, they repair the damage, and they're okay. And it could be one case for some people, another case for others. But I do know that, especially with dry hitting, and this is why I like vaping so much, is because there's a lot of variables that aren't necessary. It's like smoking is like, this is the danger, this happens, you smoke. Vaping is more like, there's a whole lot of different ways to do it and a whole lot of different options to pick from. So since you have so many options, if you are someone who vapes, don't allow it to dry hit. There's just no reason. It's such a clear increase in damage and toxicity that is completely avoidable. And again, the ways to avoid it is if you're using disposable cartridges, it can't happen. And especially if you're using those fourth generation devices, those pod mods, it won't happen. And if you are using a device where if you're someone who uses a device that can dry hit, you already know that it happens. Now don't let it get that low. And if it does get that low, if you have a dry hit, throw out that coil. Do not keep reusing it, because now when you refill with more e-liquid, the cotton that's already pyrolyzed will then leach out into that liquid. And it's just going to get worse the more you use it.
Okay. That to me, this is what I'm hearing you say from my perspective is that basically dry hitting is the most toxic and the most dangerous, and if you can avoid that, vaping may not be that bad for you. That's kind of what I'm hearing.
Okay, so we'll start there, and then we'll go forward. And the last thing I'm going to say on dry hitting before we go about, okay, well, what are the other things that can cause toxicity in vaping, or some other variables
Yeah.
to avoid? The really sad thing for me when it comes to dry hitting, so that researcher I mentioned earlier, he actually got a letter from someone who thanked him for his research. She was just a random member of the public, and she said, I have been dry hitting. I've been using these refillable coils, and the reason I use them is because I can't afford to buy these disposable coils. So the only thing I can do is have these cheaper refillable coils that I've been using well past what she even wrote in the letter. She's like, I know that I probably shouldn't use them as much as I have the same coil over and over. I just can't afford to get more. And she's like, of course I've had dry hitting, and it never even occurred to me like how bad that could be. So for me, this is sad too, because there are some people who financially are limited in what they can afford. And especially, obviously, vaping is an addictive habit. You have to continuously refill your supply of either the e-liquid or these coils or both. And so people who might feel trapped into not being able to do it in a safer way, who can't afford the other kinds of coils, this could be a kind of wake-up call where it's like, if you've already experienced a lot of dry hitting, and this is something that you can't get away from because of your financial situation, you should just quit. Like that should be a strong incentive to step away from vaping.
How expensive is it to switch? I mean, like, I don't.
It's not all that different perhaps from having to go out and continuously buy packs of cigarettes. But if you have to continuously buy not only the e-liquid but also these refillable coils, it does add up. So it's just a kind of weekly drain on the bank account, and it depends on how much you vape. Some people might be very casual vapors who only vape at a party setting or whatever, but the people who are doing it every day, that's going to add up. So yeah, it's dry hitting something that should be avoided, and the only reason it might not be avoided is because your finances might limit you from buying the other kinds of devices or coils. But it's just that in that case, I would say it's just too dangerous. It's not worth it. There's other ways to have nicotine if you're gonna do it.
Okay.
Now for the rest of vaping, we need some other factors. So in that case, we've really covered dry hitting. I also touched on third and fourth generation devices and how they produce different aerosols. So you can even easily Google and get a lot of information on third generation vape devices, how they produce, what kind of chemical byproducts they produce, specifically formaldehyde and acrolein. You can see how much is being produced. You can look up those chemicals and see how bad they are for you, and weigh out those health risks for yourself. Again, those are things that are especially more common in third generation devices. The crazy thing is, though, the flavoring will also influence the toxicity, both from the flavoring chemical itself, and the flavoring can change how much of those chemical byproducts are being produced. The formaldehyde, the acrolein, those other dangerous compounds that are not supposed to be produced by these devices. I have literally seen on one safety data sheet for a vaping flavoring, it said, do not inhale mists or vapors. So that's like, as the safety regulation, it was like, this chemical should not be inhaled. But yeah, it's a chemical for vaping. So, that covers them. They said on their safety data sheet, don't inhale Mr. Vapors. If someone bought it and if they happen to inhale it, that's not on them. So there is some just kind of ridiculousness, and that's part of this thing where it's like vaping is just too big and we can't regulate it. I think there's some mistakes in the regulation where it's like Juul bad, don't Juul, and then like Juul gets taken off the shelves. But it's like that's not. I think that's government overreach. I don't think that's fair. But then you also have stuff like this where it's like little things get through the cracks and it's just impossible to keep up with. So go ahead.
Well, you said that some are worse than like some of the flavors.
Yes.
And you made this in the lab. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, so I've not played with flavors too much, but I've seen in the research. I actually just got back from Society of Toxicology National Conference in Salt Lake City, and it's actually really funny. The way that people who research this stuff talk to each other is like can be very casual. But it's funny because I'm walking through the posters. I'm discussing.
Don't smoke the watermelon.
You're not far off. So I was walking through, talking to some people with posters, and one thing that was said is like, so why are you using cinnamon as a flavorant? And they're like, oh, I just need something with toxicity. So it's like in the case of a vape, you always want a positive result. It makes it easier to publish. And so it's like, well, how do I get a positive result? You don't always know. That's the hard thing with science, and the tricky thing about how it's hard to publish negative results. Whole different case. Any case. But cinnamon, the flavoring, is now just known as just bad. Like you just shouldn't vape
Why?
cinnamon. So cinnamaldehyde is the most common flavoring that they use. And here's another problem with the regulation. Vaping flavorants are regulated as if they were food products. So if something is safe for a food product, then it's approved to go into vape devices, even though obviously ingestion and inhalation are two completely different exposure methods. So these cinnamon flavorants was like, oh yeah, they're used in food products. You can put in your vape device, and now you're inhaling these aldehyde groups that make the cinnamon flavoring that are not good. Are just at this point, that's a very obviously known thing. Literature is just toxic.
It sounds good to
And
me. I like the cinnamon.
oh yeah, well, I actually got a little nervous too because in particular this vape conference, it wasn't just vaping with cinnamon that I was looking at. They were looking at nicotine, like oral nicotine products, like nicotine, not patches, nicotine like pouches that you ingest orally, and even like the cinnamon flavoring for that was toxic, and it could kill like gum cells and stuff like that. So
Jeez,
I'm
dude.
looking at
No,
that.
that's
I'm
a
like,
whole other thing with the
so I
microbiome.
have like some big red gum that I love to chew, and I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't even want to chew it anymore. I'm like, if cinnamon is just a
shoot.
known, it's like any other flavoring is better than cinnamon. Like that's
Yeah,
just
and
known.
is it like really like cinnamon, or is it like a flavor? A
Oh
fake?
no, these are chemical flavorants. Like these are it's not. No one's using natural cinnamon, and that would be very bad though. I mean, remember the cinnamon challenge from like 10 years ago that
Oh
was
wait,
viral?
yeah.
Where you got that ended up, I think, hospitalized some
The cloud.
people. Yeah,
Oh my
did you know? I think some people got hospitalized from that
Wait, no.
because you're like, if you swallow the cinnamon, you're fine, but the people who like choked on it really badly, that's bad for your lungs.
Comes out
Like
the
cinnamon
nose, comes out the eyes.
it's like cinnamon, even the natural product, is not good in your lungs. There are plenty of things you can ingest that you're not supposed to inhale. And yeah, it turns out those really fine powders are not good to inhale. Just as a general rule, I would avoid very fine particulate matter if you can. A lot of people can't, like in their work exposure or something. But yeah, so cinnamon so natural cinnamon is not good to inhale. Neither are its chemical recreations. So yeah, I'm even now worried about my cinnamon gum. But yeah, so some flavorants are just worse than others. There's also another crazy case. I don't even understand how this was ever thought to be a good idea. But butter flavoring, they're using the chemical diacetyl. And in the mid 2000s, diacetyl was potentially correlated with lung issues, and it's called popcorn lung, because the people in the movie theaters who were using the butter popcorn were breathing in diacetyl over long periods of time, and they think that could have been caused. That's why it's called popcorn lungs, because the movie theater workers working popcorn were getting these lung conditions.
No, I didn't know that. I've never heard of that. Wait, so it's a fake butter, basically, is what you're saying?
Yes, pretty much. And so
everything is so freaking fake and processed, and I did not know. I mean, this makes me so mad because so many things are affecting people's health when it comes to food. And then let's just like throw in vaping. It's like you're already being poisoned out there. Like, why with everything else you're eating and breathing and all
we
the
are
toxins,
living
and now
in
you're
a
gonna have
toxic
vaping.
cesspool in the modern era. There's no getting around it. But it's like you can go to a movie theater, you can eat the popcorn, you're fine. But the people who are working with it and breathing in those fumes for long periods of time, they had the chance of developing this condition.
Wait, so it causes
the
popcorn
chemical
lungs?
Yeah, that buttery flavoring chemical, diacetyl, is now being used in butter flavored vapes. And it's like, why would you use that same chemical that was associated with popcorn lung in a vape device? Like, it's a terrible idea. So yeah, there's certain flavors that are just obviously worse than others. Cinnamon is at the top of the list. There's also problems with some flavors, for example, especially this is common with like heavy dessert flavors, where they just used a high number of flavors. It might be like triple fudge chocolate mousse, and it's just like packed full of flavoring chemicals that make it most likely more toxic than others.
Okay, so I have a question. Can people smoke without any of the the flavorings?
Yeah, so there's just like tobacco flavoring. There's menthol flavoring. Those are generally safer than the other ones. Menthol has some problems too. For example, ice flavorings are really popular. It'd be like strawberry ice, where not only do you have the strawberry flavoring, you also have that like mint or menthol to give that ice cooling effect. And those can have more toxic effects than just without that. So it's not like any particular flavor is safe per se, but the less flavoring you have in general, the safer. And the more, if it sounds less, if it sounds like it's better for your lungs, it probably is. So in the idea of like cinnamons, like I don't want to inhale cinnamon. Turns out you shouldn't inhale the cinnamon flavoring either. And like the fruit products are generally a little more safer than like the dessert products. But again, it depends on the specific flavor and the specific flavoring compounds being used, how many flavoring compounds you have in there, what's the percentage compared to the other e-liquid ingredients, compared to the diluent and the psychoactive ingredients. Like the ratios matter. And that's why this is so hard, because there's no one thing you can say. It's like every flavor is different. And you just have to, if you're concerned about it, you should just know what's in your vape flavor.
Yeah, it just sounds like you're saying like there's different chemicals, obviously, because different chemical compounds make up different flavors. And
yeah,
but man, like who's gonna go and research all that? Like,
well, that's why
I mean,
there's a clear trend. The more flavoring compounds, or in other words, like the heavier the flavor is, the worse it probably is. So if you have strawberry, blueberry, ice flavor, like that's three things. So now you have three things to worry about. So the simpler the flavor, the better. The less going on in your device, the better. And that I think is a good universal rule for vaping, a good reminder for everybody that even the word vape is a misconception. Because I actually heard this when I was trying to explain vaping to somebody at a party. They're like, oh, like it's vapor. It's like, like water vapor, like water, it boils, you get vapor. It's like, that's what's happening in this device. It's not a vapor. A vapor is a liquid that is then in the air. This is an aerosol, which means that you have those liquid molecules, which is your diluent. This is propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin, usually in conjunction. Those are vapors that then contain gaseous and solid particles. So in other words, you don't get this very nice, simple, I put a little flavor here, put a little propylene glycol, this comes out nice, easy vapor. That's not what you get. You get this complex mixture, this aerosol. So I like to say it's not right to call it vaping. You're aerosolizing. It's never going to catch on, but that's the true process of what's happening. Vaping is a misnomer. So it's a very complex mixture. And the point of me saying that is to remind people that, again, you're not just boiling water here. You're putting a lot of chemicals together and you're bringing them to really high heat with a metal coil, which is another thing we have to bring up, is there's some metal toxicity potentially with this too. You're bringing them to a high heat with a metal coil. And so the chemicals that you're initially putting in are not what's coming out. You obviously have chemical reactions. And that's where these dangerous byproducts like the formaldehyde and the acrolein are coming from. It's because things are breaking down and changing at that high temperature before they leave the vape device. So you're getting this cloud of this mixture of things that is not just the simple ingredients you may put into your vape device. So even the simplest mixture of an e-liquid is going to be different coming out the pipe than what you put into it.
It's just so much. It's like, I am pretty much sold on never vaping. I wasn't really interested in it to begin with, obviously, but now, like, if I was interested, I'm definitely not right now, because this is not sounding good to me.
it almost feels like you need to be an expert to even try to vape safely, because there's so many things that like I would just avoid, because again, it's like, how dangerous is it? It's really hard to just say that, like, how do you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10? It's a difficult thing to say objectively. Here's how bad it is. Here's how many times you can do it in a day. That's just not really statements we can make. But at this point, if I was going to vape, I would have so many questions I would ask before it ever got close to my mouth that like it would probably never pass my series of tests before it got there. But we can move on now and talk about what I think is the safest form of vaping.
And well, I want to move on to that, but what about the coil, the metal coil?
Yeah. So now this is something where you can usually definitively say if there is enough metal concentration to actually cause issues. And sadly, I don't remember the exact numbers, so I don't want to be too specific on this. All I know is that there are specific metals leaving the liquid that are in the actual condensate from the aerosol. So in other words, when you inhale this e-liquid, it will contain metals. It will contain heavy metals. Some of them are from the coil itself. So the coil that I'm using, I did an elemental analysis on it. It was like 60 to 70% iron, almost 27% chromium, and about 3% aluminum. And so there are some coils that are specifically coming, there's some metals that specifically come from the coil itself that leach off into the liquid and into the aerosol. But there's other metals too that are just like in the wall device, in your atomizer at the bottom of your vape device below the coil, that are also leaving the aerosol. So we saw some nickel, we saw some, there can be arsenic, there can be lead. Now, they might not be at concentrations that are toxic. They might not be at concentrations that are toxic, but it's I don't remember the exact numbers on it.
Okay. Well, we can plug that in onto the video. We'll plug your research and numbers, or we'll link it below the podcast. So no worries about that. We'll link it in.
Yeah, I mean, and this is just something, again, like anyone who vapes, who's now concerned about these things, you now become an at-home researcher. Go to Google Scholar, type arsenic e-liquid vaping, and you'll get a paper that's measuring it, and they will tell you like if it's above a toxic limit or below that limit.
Amen. I think everybody should be doing their independent research. They should be checking what you're saying and looking into it for themselves, because with anything we eat, drink, consume, like, we need to be our own private researchers. We should care about our bodies, and especially if we're giving it to other people, like, we should be doing our own research 100%.
Yeah.
So thanks.
I will say, if I remember correctly, arsenic may not have been a big threat with vaping. But my list here, so I just pulled up I have a spreadsheet. I'm currently writing my paper. Aluminum, chromium, and iron are from the coil. We're seeing that to some extent, not very high levels in the condensate necessarily. There's also nickel, copper, zinc, and lead. And that's just from this one independent analysis. So there's a lot of papers out there that are specifically looking at metal, and will have more specific numbers.
And we can probably link some of those peer review studies to whatever research we have on that. So I am curious, though, because you mentioned chromium, aluminum, and other things. Like, what are those effects on the lungs or the body? Like, what are you finding?
I mean, there's heavy metal poisoning, right? So I don't think this is going to be a major concern with vaping necessarily. I'm sure there are conditions that will make it worse, and in other cases better. So again, it's like if you're using refillable coils, that liquid can sit in there longer. It can leach off more. There could be things that do lead to more of a concern with that. It's just something to be aware of, that this is in your aerosol. But heavy metal poisoning is just kind of a general thing where, of course, those metals in the aerosol will get into your bloodstream and can have downstream effects throughout the body. If they're at a high enough dosage that the body can't get rid of it. But it's also something that over a long period of time, we might find out that you do reach toxic levels of metal poisoning from vaping.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound good. And I would actually really appreciate if you took some of my hairspray that I just purchased and go test that in your lab. Let me know.
Yeah, I could run it by one of my chemists.
Okay, cool.
Do some scans on it. So metal, I would not say is the biggest concern with vaping from the current literature, but it's a concern, and it's something that could become more concerning over time.
Sure.
So if I were to recommend people vaping, if I were to talk to someone who does vape and give them my recommendations, I would stay away from high wattage, low resistance devices that are open-ended. So all this is covered by those third generation tank devices. The higher the wattage, the lower the resistance of the coil, the more byproducts you're getting. The more formaldehyde, the more acrylate. That's pretty well seen in the literature. So people who are vaping in like the 5 to 20 watt range is a lot safer than those kind of hobbyist, high throat hit vapors who are in the 60 to 80 to maybe 100 wattage on their device. That's going to become worse. And the sub-ohm vaping is an idea with these third generation devices. It's just also worse. It produces more of those dangerous byproducts.
And say that again, sub what?
Sub-ohm. So your unit of resistance is an ohm. And if you're below 1 ohm resistance in your coil, you can produce like bigger, thicker clouds, which is, again, for some people who are doing like vape tricks, is maybe something that they want. But one of the problems with those big, thick clouds is that they are thick with more chemical byproducts.
Okay.
So it's not just more propylene glycol in that cloud. It's more other stuff too. Thermal.
I'm going to quote on that. More other stuff too.
Other stuff. Again, yeah. Formaldehyde, the acrylate, the other dangerous aldehydes, the PAHs, your polyaromatic hydrocarbons. So other chemical groups as well.
Okay.
So for me, I instinctively want to shift people towards those newer fourth generation devices, the smaller, sleeker ones with disposable coils that just work a little bit better at producing what you want and less of what you don't want. But then there's another problem with that, right? And so I mentioned this earlier, that there are some acid components in there, and not to like, I'm not trying to use a word that sounds scary in the general public. Like acid is just a chemical term, acid and base, right? It's not like necessarily dangerous. Like a lactic acid is something they use. And the reason why they're using it in these kinds of devices is to form nicotine salt. So free-base nicotine is what you had in most devices up until a few years ago. But the problem with free-base nicotine is it's harsher. It gives you more of that throat hit. And so they couldn't use it at as high of concentrations. Now, if they use nicotine salt, so you bind the nicotine to something like lactic acid, it's a much easier form to take in. And so now you can have a single cartridge of an e-liquid be the equivalent of a whole pack of cigarettes. And that's just because it's full of so much nicotine because of these nicotine salts.
It's that high?
It's
in
that
concentration?
high. Yeah. And so it's like, maybe one cart is like 5,000 puffs, which is a lot. And so some people might be like, oh, well, I don't go through a cart. I go through a cart like every 2 weeks or something, or every month. I barely use it. And other people will use it much more. And that's the problem, is that it's so highly concentrated. You can just get so much more nicotine in a short period of time. So the people with conventional cigarettes, it's very regulated, even in the habit itself, where it's like, if I want to smoke, I have to go outside and I smoke a cigarette. And the only way I'm going to get like a lot more nicotine is if I'm going to sit there and chain smoke, which like even in the term chain smoking is almost known to not be good. It's like, oh, you shouldn't do that.
Right.
With vaping though, it's much more subtle, where it's like, I can just take a hit, put it back in my pocket at a party, and every 3 minutes I might be doing this and not even realizing how much nicotine I'm getting. You don't have that very clear number of like, I just smoked 3 cigarettes. That was probably too many. You don't really know that with vaping. And because it's so much more concentrated now with these new devices, it can just be a full of nicotine, which is like, some people get excited by that. Like, yay, a lot more nicotine.
It's concerning.
But it is concerning, especially because we mentioned the problem with vaping is it's targeting this 18 to 24-year-old and high school and middle school age groups. Those are your biggest proponents of vaping.
And I feel like people I don't know if this is an assumption, like, do young kids even know how highly, highly addictive nicotine is? Because I know 3 people personally that have tried to get off cigarettes, 2 successfully, 1 not so successfully. All 3 of them talked about just how the pull of it was so strong, and it was one of the most difficult things they ever had to do. And they're like chewing the gum and rolling up the fake ciggies to put in their mouth, and the patches, and it's like, oh my god. And they just talked about the in-depth struggle that they went through trying to break that habit. And so talk about that.
Let's talk about why that is. Yeah. So nicotine, first of all, is a lot less dangerous if you're over the age of 25, because nicotine can basically prevent your brain from growing, is one way of like a common way of putting it.
Oh shoot.
But it will prevent some of those pathways from forming. And so we say that 25 is when you are finishing your development neurologically. If you're having a lot of nicotine before that, it can stunt that growth and that development, and you'll have less pathways being formed in your brain.
What kind of pathways?
So generally the way brain development works is, especially up until the age of 25, you're just forming a lot of neural pathways. And it's not like necessarily for one particular thing. It's not like a pathway for learning or a pathway for memory formation, but it's just a lot of pathways being formed in your brain. And then after you get past the age of 25, your brain typically starts cutting down on those pathways to just what you've been using and what you actively use. And so you reduce those neural pathways onwards to the rest of your life. And some will still form, right? If you start using new neural pathways, they have to. But in general, your brain branches out a lot to be more adaptable in your early life. Nicotine prevents that process to an extent. And so that's one of the biggest concerns with nicotine is there's still, I don't think, I'm definitely not a neurologist. I don't know the extent of it. I don't even know if in general we really know the extent of the kind of brain development and how it changes over time that well. But for me, that was instantly my biggest concern, is those neural pathways not developing because of nicotine is
Mm-hmm.
instantly the biggest threat.
Mm-hmm.
So even there are some obvious pros of nicotine. It's like it increases concentration, kind of like coffee. It increases the pleasure reward pathway. Feels good. So there are things from nicotine that are, you could say, positives.
And it kind of
But
relaxes you, right? Like,
yeah, of course, for sure. And so, if you're over the age of 25, you could find reasons to want to have nicotine. But for me, that's a clear cutoff. If you're not 25, if you still are growing neurologically, you shouldn't have nicotine. And that's what makes vaping so unsettling, is not only is it so concentrated in nicotine, it's specifically being used by these age groups who are young, who should not have nicotine yet, if you're going to do it. Now, the other problem is, you mentioned nicotine addiction. And yeah, it's a problem. And it is a problem with vaping. So I go to a local vape shop to buy my coils, to get my devices. And even when I'm purchasing, like the girl who works there, like I see her hand shaking as she's pointing at stuff through the glass case. I'm like, which of these devices do you recommend? And her hand's shaking. She takes a hit.
oh my
Um,
God.
the nicotine withdrawal is pretty serious. And
It's like a skit. It's like a comedy skit, but it's real.
yeah,
It's
but not,
sad.
it's a comedy sketch, but not funny.
Yeah.
Um,
Jeez, dude.
and
Which one of
it's
these do you want?
sad. Yeah,
Lord have
it's sad
mercy.
because that is possible to reach that level of addiction, because the vape device is so easy and can always be on you. You can always do it, and it has so much nicotine. It's easy to get to that point where you are at a really high level of addiction.
Hmm.
And to understand kind of why that addiction happens, so
Mm-hmm.
here's an example. You have certain channels in your cells, ion channels, that open up in response to a ligand binding to them. These are ligand bound ion channels. And so a ligand is just any molecule, chemical substrate that binds to a receptor. It's not a specific term, it's a general term. You have a very well-known neurotransmitter in your body, acetylcholine, that is especially active in the neuromuscular junction to transmit a signal from a nervous cell to a muscular cell. But it's also an important channel in brain-to-brain communication for things like what I just mentioned, reward pathway and concentration. And there's a specific subtype of these really popular acetylcholine channels called nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And so these receptors bind to nicotinic compounds in the same way that they bind to acetylcholine. So what happens is, when you ingest nicotine and it gets to the brain, it binds to these channels and it opens them up, and it triggers these pathways like concentration and reward pathway. But what happens is, this can happen with any ion channel, is desensitization. So the more channel is used, the more it opens up, the less likely it is to open the next time it sees that ligand. And so if you are addicted to nicotine, the reason you're addicted is because those channels have become so desensitized that not only are they no longer responding to nicotine in the same way, you need more and more and more to get them to respond. You have to flood your brain and blood with nicotine, but they're no longer responding to acetylcholine anymore like they used to, or the other nicotinic ligands in your body.
That's really interesting. So
Yeah,
it's
so
almost, it's weird because and there may be no correlation to this, but we're talking about addiction, and I've done like a little bit of research on like pornography addiction, and it seems like the more people abuse, I mean, like do pornography, watch pornography, like they need more of it. They need like more like harsher types of
yeah,
pornography. Like it starts, like, I don't know if that's similar to what
yeah.
you're
Well,
talking about with the
because I was
brain.
about to make a contrast and be like, well, desensitization is different in the way I'm using it, but at the same time, it might not be that different, because you are right. When we say people get desensitized to something like pornography, the same maybe lower level porn doesn't work for them anymore, and they go into more hardcore categories. That is a known effect.
Mm.
And I don't know the details of what that looks like in the brain, but that could be something very similar to
Yeah,
the
I'm curious.
physical desensitization of these channels. And they do result in similar addictive patterns, where you get more into a habit, or deeper, more extreme in a certain activity. So it's true for pornography. It's also true with nicotine use, where it feels like you need more and more nicotine to get the same effect that you got before. And that's why people do increase in nicotine usage and do smoke or vape more as time goes on, because they get desensitized to it. But the problem now is, so let's look at the benefits of nicotine. So I smoke or I vape, and I'm more concentrated. I'm getting some pleasure because those reward pathways are activating. And maybe, like I'm working on a project, and now I'm like more concentrated, and working on it faster and more efficiently. I'm like, oh, this is great. Well, now every time I'm working on something that's difficult or that I need to concentrate on, now I want to have nicotine because it makes me work better. Again, not too different from coffee or caffeine.
I was just thinking that. I was like, dude, get a coffee and a piece of chocolate.
Yeah, not too different. But now the problem is, so now I'm using nicotine more for that, or I just feels good. There's that pleasure pathway. And so again, it's more of a casual or party setting. I'm just doing because it feels good. But now what happens is when those channels do become desensitized, now my natural ligands aren't working. So now it's not, you don't get the pro necessarily anymore. Now it's not just like, oh, when I do use nicotine, I have more concentration. Now without it, I can't concentrate. I don't feel particularly rewarded. And that's where that withdrawal comes from.
Dude, that's so damaging.
It can be, and it depends. So the kind of damage depends on the channels, depends on the desensitization, depends on the pathway. In the case of nicotine, it's like if I reach a higher level of addiction and I try to cut myself off, you can expect at least 3 days that are not going to be fun. I mean, it's like I can't think, I can't focus, I don't feel good, I can't sleep, my appetite's crazy. It's just until those channels can resensitize and just respond to your normal body's processes.
So how long does it take for your channels to resensitize?
With nicotine, you normally have 3 bad days of withdrawal and a week or 2 past that of getting back to normal. To where
and does that worsen with length of time of use with the recovery time?
It's certainly your recovery time, your withdrawal absolutely matters on how much nicotine you're doing. Time might not be necessarily the factor. It's not like I've smoked for 10 years. Now this is going to suck to get off of it. It could be I vaped for 1 year, but in that year I ramped up really quickly. And now my channels are at this level of addiction. I maybe got there just as fast as a decade-long smoker because I ramped up so quickly. So I don't think it's necessarily like length of time of use as much as it is concentration of use. Okay. I mean, like as an experiment, for example, I could start vaping 1,000 puffs a day. That'd be difficult, but I could do it. But I could probably do that for a week just to see what would happen. And I bet you by the end of that week, I would hit the same withdrawal as a decade-long smoker.
That would make a great hashtag.
I'll run the study on myself. N equals 1. This is really bad. Puffs. Don't do this is the conclusion. But yeah, so with nicotine, it's like a solid 3 days bad withdrawal symptoms, a week or 2 of total withdrawal, and then your channels will come back to their normal sensitization, and you can concentrate and have pleasurable reward pathways.
Yeah, but then you puff again, and it destroys it all.
That's again. The thing. Yeah, so it's like I gotta get through 3 days of this. Maybe I'm just gonna have 1 right now. I really need to concentrate because you can't necessarily put life on hold for 2 weeks to recover from this. Like I still have projects. Maybe you're in school. Maybe you have work. It's like I need to concentrate.
Well, so and you're addicted.
How do I stop? Yeah, and then again, that addiction. So the addiction is not just like. We might kind of minimize it and be like, oh, they just enjoy it. Maybe they're not strong enough. It's like, it's not just that. It's like you are having your brain function is not functioning the way it should be. So it's like when they say I need it, it really feels like you need it because you might not be able to concentrate without it. Those channels are not working. That pathway is not working. So it's like, yeah, I need it to concentrate. If you're going through nicotine withdrawal, you might need it to concentrate. You might not be able to without it. So not everyone can just like take 2 weeks to purge this from their system altogether and stop cold turkey. If you did, after 2 weeks, you probably would be back to normal. But that's why so many people have to kind of slowly take their nicotine intake down over time because they're still trying to function on a day-to-day basis. And that's what makes it so difficult to quit. So it's not as dangerous as something like alcohol withdrawal, where the withdrawal itself can actually kill you with alcohol poisoning.
Wait, really?
Yeah, if you're a really serious alcoholic.
I don't drink or anything, but
if you're a really serious alcoholic, and I don't know the details on this, but I know like if you're an extreme case, if you just stop cold turkey and do nothing, you can die from that, or you can have serious damage. Yeah. So that's why they will like. There's different ways to cut yourself off. Like obviously, it's like okay, well I'm going to have instead of 10 drinks a day, I'm going to start with 8 drinks a day, and then go down to 5 drinks. You can wean yourself off the alcohol that way, or I think they will prescribe. What's the name? Is it benzoates? They can give you something instead to treat the alcohol withdrawal.
I honestly, I really have not heard of this before. Maybe this is common knowledge, but I.
So this is an example of a withdrawal that's worse. Nicotine withdrawal is not like physically toxic like alcohol withdrawal can be because your body will start releasing toxins with alcohol withdrawal. But with nicotine withdrawal, it's just like just hard to function. It's just difficult to
Mm-hmm,
deal with.
mm-hmm.
And especially, I mean, you're going to be irritable because you can't sleep, your appetite's whack. So there's a lot of things that just make you not only irritated and feel bad and not able to concentrate, it's just hard to function. But you can get through it. There are much worse cases. So there's worse cases of withdrawal, like alcohol. There's also worse cases of desensitization, like cocaine. So cocaine activates your dopaminergic pathways. They make you feel rewarded and pleasurable, more so than nicotine. The problem with that desensitization is that might never come back. So people who have cocaine addiction or serious cocaine usage at one point in their life, even years later, they might still be depressed. They might not be able to feel pleasure like they could before cocaine. So this is an example of like, okay, nicotine's a lot safer than some of these other things that are difficult to quit. But that doesn't mean it's easy to quit nicotine. And if you get to that level of addiction, you get to that level of desensitization, it can be really difficult to quit. And so to circle back to now the vaping, so it's like, okay, the devices that are safer in terms of the coils and the byproducts that are produced in the aerosol also typically have more nicotine. So it's like, I don't want that high of a concentration of nicotine.
Mm-hmm.
If I want to be able to concentrate on something, or I'm just like, oh, I'm really stressed, I need something, I don't want to hit a vape that has 50 milligrams per mil of nicotine in it. It's too much.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, with some of these vapes and with some of these like Zyn products, I've seen like 6 milligram Zyns. The Zyns are like the little oral things that you take and suck on for nicotine.
Okay.
I think some of those, it's actually happened. Some grad students use it. And another grad student was like, oh, can I have one of those? Like we're watching a seminar, like, can I have one of those? One of your Zyns? And like she had to leave and go to the bathroom because she got nauseous, because it's like, if you are someone who's reached like that amount of nicotine is normal for you, keep in mind that's enough for someone else, it gives them a headache or makes them nauseous. Like they can't even take in that much. And that's how much nicotine is in some of these products, which to me is just like mind blowing. So in my case, if I were to vape, it would have to be a low concentration of nicotine. It would have to be a device that doesn't use refillable coils. It would have to be a flavoring that I considered safe and overall a minor amount of flavorants.
Okay.
And the chance of me finding this perfect combination is just really unlikely. And even then, I'm only minimizing the risks. So the risks of vaping that I think are very clear in the literature right now, it's like, yes, vaping is safer than cigarettes. That just means so little to me because cigarettes are very dangerous. And we know that. Some very clear... Yeah, go ahead.
And we also don't know enough about vaping to do a proper
comparison.
because they may be completely different, but so dangerous in and of themselves. Distinctly dangerous is what I mean.
That's the problem. So with my literature review, it's very difficult because you read one paper and it's like, oh, look, vaping is not causing effects, it's safe. And then you read another one, it's like, oh, look at these toxic effects, it's not safe. And then for me, part of what I did with my review paper is I took a lot of these papers that had contrasting results, and I looked at this one that was like, oh, look, it has a safe result. I'm like, look which device they're using, look which flavorants they're using, look at these other factors that could be giving them a safe result. Over here, like, here's cinnamon, here's a creme brulee, so these flavors are worse. Here's a third generation device. Like, so trying to make sense of these different results. And then I think that's one of the problems in the vaping field is some of these research labs maybe don't know about all these different variables, or it's not well communicated yet. Or someone will just say, we use this vape device, and I'm like, well, like, how many puffs per minute did you use? Like what wattage are you using? Like, there's so many different factors with these devices where some of these papers don't write very clear methods, very descriptive methods. I'm like, you can't tell me vaping is safe and not tell me how many times you use the device per minute. Did you use 3 second long puffs? Did you use 1 second long activations? Like, all this matters for vaping. And that's why it can be very frustrating to read through literature and someone be like, look, it's safer than smoking. And it's like, great, you didn't even tell me what your device was. You just said you used an electronic nicotine delivery system. I'm like, that tells me nothing. Because really, when you do a research paper on vaping, you can't say vaping is this or that. All you can say is this device at this setting with this e-liquid has these effects. And then you have to compile all of these different studies together and abstract out these patterns, which is what I've tried to do with my review paper. And that's how I've come to some conclusions of like, oh, third generation is consistently having more toxic effects, and cinnamon is bad, but some of these other flavorants they have tiers of danger.
Yeah.
And I've tried to come to some just generalized conclusions by doing that.
That's so good and helpful. And I do want to add that by the time this this episode gets published, your paper will be published also. So I'll
I
be
think
able
so,
to
yeah.
link it to the podcast so people
Hopefully.
can read it.
Yeah. The peer review process can be long and painful, but hopefully it gets through by the time this podcast comes out.
Hopefully, a few people
There's
will
the
read it.
review
That'll be good.
paper, and there's also the research paper with the dry hitting. And yeah, I'm really curious how that one does in the peer review process, because I might get someone from the tobacco industry who's like, you can't do this and these methods are bad. I have no idea.
They
really
can
depends.
prevent you from publishing it.
If it depends who you get on your peer review, and this is true for any scientific paper. Sometimes you just get really tough reviewers, and sometimes you get people who feel more fair in what they say. And because some people just have their personal preferences too. They're like, I like to do this assay, you didn't do it, you should run this instead. And it's like, I'm not doing that. Like, that's not what I'm trying to do. So you really don't know in the peer review process who you're going to get. But yeah, I could get someone who's just like staunchly opposed to dry hitting, who's like, that's a mishandling device, that's not proper, and they could recommend rejecting my paper from the journal. So
that's crazy.
Yeah, so I really don't know how that's going to go, but I might get people who are more open to it, or who maybe are more neutral on it. I have no idea. And I am labeling it in my paper as a mishandling of the device. I'm like, this is not the way the device is supposed to be used, but it is happening, so we should look at these effects. So hopefully that makes it go through the review process a little bit better. But yeah, so hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, maybe the review paper, which looks at a lot of different papers, a lot of different other people's research articles, and tries to abstract out some of those general trends that I've talked about today. Hopefully that is out, and maybe also my own research on dry hitting will be out. But yeah, so when it comes to vaping, I think the biggest threat, I would say, other than I think dry hitting is the worst, and no one should dry hit. Do your best to avoid it, and if you can afford it, just don't buy those coils, I would say. Because it is a mishandling of the device. So even the vape companies say you're not supposed to do that. Other than that, for me, the nicotine itself is the biggest problem. And it's just so highly concentrated now. The Juul, the Elf bars, you should look into what the concentration of nicotine is in your cartridge. And then, so it might give you a unit that you're not familiar with. It might say something like 50 mg per mil, 50 milligrams per milliliter. And that might mean nothing to you. Then you can also look up, well, what's the concentration of nicotine in a pack of cigarettes? And you'll probably get the same unit. Or if it gives you a different one, if it gives you like parts per million of nicotine, you can just Google convert ppm to mg per ml, and you can get the same units. And then you at least have a reference point, because you might be like, my cartridge is half a pack of cigarettes. And then you can weigh that out yourself. Like, how many times do I hit it? How many cartridges do I go through per week or month or year? Is this too much? How much nicotine do I want? How old am I? Do I value these neurological pathways that my body is trying to produce right now? I have heard some people say like, who cares? Like, I don't care if my brain gets stunted. I'm just here to have a good time. And it's like, to someone like that, I'm not like trying to get them to change anything.
Well, maybe, and there's some people that really legitimately don't care until later in life when they're suffering the consequences.
That's the problem.
But like, I feel like there's a disconnect because it's just like such a sciencey term, neurological pathways. We're like, okay, bro, who cares? But they don't really understand when you say there's damage to your neurological development and pathways, especially between the age of like 18, 25 or whatever. They don't really understand what you mean by that. To be fair.
I don't have a neurology background. I don't fully understand it. I just know when I heard that, and learned that about nicotine, it was enough for me to be like, okay, until I'm 25, I'm definitely not going to touch this stuff. That was one of my takeaways.
Where did you hear it from, and could we link some of those sources?
So I was looking up nicotine. I was curious how bad it was, because I kind of wanted to use it to concentrate more. I was like, how bad could this be? And the Huberman podcast, if you don't know Andrew Huberman, very popular online. He has a whole YouTube video on nicotine, and he discussed that. So he is like a neurology lab. So he had some more information there, and that's where I first heard about that. And to me, I think that was the most concerning aspect of nicotine, the most concerning side effect of nicotine, other than just the withdrawal in general and the concern of becoming desensitized and not being able to concentrate without it. It's one thing to be like, oh man, I'm going to work on this project. I really need something. I'm going to use nicotine this one time or whatever. And I feel like that's a more safe usage. And so for me, with my own personal conclusion, I decided that really I never want to vape because and I've talked to some people who are like, oh, you know, I'm only going to do hookah. Like they'll draw their own lines. The lungs are the filter of your body. It turns out there's really nothing that your lungs want to inhale other than air, and anything else goes into them. Yes, and which is becoming rarer these days. But anything else that goes into the lungs, they have to filter and get rid of. And I just don't know what could happen if I inhale. Again, you're already inhaling so many things your lungs have to filter out. Why would I throw more stuff onto it intentionally? They have enough to worry about. And we are living in a day and age where we are kind of in this cesspool of toxins around us at all times in what we ingest and what we inhale. Yes. And the less stress I can put on my system, the better. So I'm going to do everything I can to protect myself. And that just means I'm not going to vapor smoke, period, because the lungs are not meant to process that. Their job is to get rid of that whenever something like that gets into them. So if I were to do nicotine, it would only be orally. That would be my first consideration. Okay. It couldn't be at too high of a concentration. Like anything over 5 milligrams is insane. I mean, as a beginner to nicotine, you couldn't even stomach it. Like 1 milligram concentration would be probably a strong line for me. The concentration had to be low enough.
Really quick, didn't you say there was an effect was it nicotine on the gums? Is that what you said earlier? Or was it?
So the cinnamon flavoring had an effect on gum.
Oh, cinnamon.
I would say this is also related. So my third stipulation would be that the nicotine couldn't be a tobacco product. So obviously nicotine comes from tobacco plants, but other parts of tobacco are known carcinogens. So that's why people who, for example, just chew dip will have oral cancer or mouth cancer. So the tobacco itself, yes, and that can cause gum disease and cause other problems. Even this flavored, not tobacco, but flavored nicotine pouches could cause gum disease. So if I were to do nicotine, it honestly wouldn't have flavor. It wouldn't have tobacco. It wouldn't go into my lungs. It would be a low enough concentration. And like if you take out all these factors, pretty much the only thing I found that I would even consider over the age of 25, nicotine toothpicks. It's like just nicotine, no tobacco, no flavorants, low concentration. And I could, in theory, pop in a toothpick when I'm writing or doing something that takes a lot of concentration on days where I'm struggling. And I think there's like one, from the Human podcast, I think he mentioned one scientist who was known for doing that when he was writing. It was like a nicotine toothpick. So there's two ideas. There is the dose determines the poison. So anything is toxic at certain levels. That's nicotine by itself is toxic at certain levels. The other ingredients of vaping will become toxic depending on how much you're having. And even if we don't know the extent of vaping right now, there's always a limit for anything you do that your body will struggle with. It's going to put stress on your system. And the second thing is just the more ingredients you're putting in there, the more factors that are coming into play, the more likely something's going to go wrong. And I think the three clearest effects of vaping, to kind of circle back to like, what does vaping do? The clearest things I saw was damage to the mucociliary escalatory system. So escalator system, basically the ciliated cells in your respiratory system have to push mucus up and down, and that gets more difficult to do from vaping. And there's a couple of reasons why. The cilia themselves become damaged and the cilia beat frequency gets decreased. Your number of cilia get decreased. So I didn't see a single paper that when they looked at the cilia didn't see damage to them. So I think it's very clear that vaping damages ciliated cells, which are very important for proper respiratory function. And two, it's a dual effect because not only do the cilia, they're supposed to move the mucus up and down, get damaged and beat less frequently, the mucus itself becomes thicker. And that becomes a problem with the ratio. There's two proteins that work in combination to form the viscosity of your mucus. It's MUC5AC and MUC5B. And that ratio gets disrupted. That makes your mucus more thick. And that doesn't perhaps sound very like alarming to a lot of people. To me, I already have very thick mucus. I'm like constantly congested. So that was scary to me. I'm like,
oh, no, this is struggling with it today.
Yeah, I'm like, I already need a Claritin D just because I woke up today. Like I don't need anything to make that harder.
But and so what are the benefits, biologically of healthy mucus and thick mucus?
Yeah, so the reason you have that mucociliary escalator system, I always mess that up, but the reason you have that system is they're there to help filter out toxins that are coming into your lungs. And so this is going to kind of play back on what I said earlier, where it's like there's not a lot of vaping literature, so we can't make broad conclusions about some of this stuff. But I've seen 2 papers where viral infections through the lung were more common because of vaping, or more likely in people who did vape. So there is a potential synchronicity between vaping and infection. So it makes your lungs worse at what they're supposed to do, which is to keep you safe from what you're inhaling. So you could see more viral infections in people who vape. You also almost certainly saw increase in the either percentage or severity of people who already had pre-existing conditions like asthma or COPD. So in other words, if you are going to have some kind of lung trouble for maybe some other cause, the vaping will make it worse. Or if you already have, I mean, if anyone was asthmatic, I would think they'd have to be crazy to vape, because it's like your lungs, you were dealt a bad hand for one reason or another. Maybe you got exposed to something early in life. Maybe you have genetic factors. You should not stress that system anymore, because it's already struggling, and there's no reason to put more damage on it that you don't know what might happen down the road in your life. So yes, those kind of small things like the mucus or the ciliated cells can cause downstream effects by your lungs not being able to filter out other things that are going into them, other particles, other toxins, other viral particles, other viruses. And so you can have other worse problems from your lungs not being able to function in the small things over time. Yeah, I think that, so the cilia was a major thing I saw. There's a couple other ones too, a couple other major effects that I was seeing in the review paper, but it's been like a year since I looked at that, so I don't.
Well, we can link that too. It's no worries, and we'll also put some bullet points on the most researched major effects from vaping.
Yeah,
so I think you did an excellent job, and it's really packed with good information. And I think you're very well balanced with your approach on this, and it's going to be, I believe, helpful to a lot of people if they listen. So I really appreciate it, Jon. I appreciate your time and all the research that you're doing and all the years of this research. And it's just super, super helpful and very interesting. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is really fun for me to talk about it. And I was surprised at how easily some of these conversations went. Like I would see someone at a bar, I'd see them vaping, like, oh, what device is that? Or what flavor are you using? And then I would tell them what I do. I'm like, oh, I'm actually looking into vaping and the negative health effects of it. And sometimes right away they'd be like, oh, I've been trying to quit, but I wasn't sure. And so sometimes people just need a little confirmation, like that, yes, there are negative side effects of vaping. And a lot of those negative side effects are just from the nicotine itself. So it's like, if you already have concerns, you have good reason to be concerned. There are known problems with it.
Some people instinctively just know, you can feel it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for covering this topic today, Jon. And as a closing for something kind of fun, so people can kind of get to know you on a more personal level. You have a very vibrant background going on behind you. I see Mario and Yoshi eggs and really cute stuff. So
yeah, very serious stuff.
Yeah, very serious stuff. So what do you do for fun? Are you a
yeah, I definitely, I used to do a lot more gaming. I don't have a whole lot of time, sadly. I played the newest Mario Wonder game. I didn't get to finish it, but maybe I'll go back and be able to finish it. I've been a fan of, for this stuff in particular, I've been especially a fan of Nintendo since I was little. So I don't play a whole lot of games anymore, but I still like the worlds and the characters and whatnot. But I think lately the only thing I've really done for fun is I'll watch an episode of House before going to bed at night, and then that's kind of the limit. And I'll go out to trivia once a week. But that's I don't do a whole lot of else other than that these days. But I do still have I'll always be fond of the games I grew up with and gaming as a whole. It's a fun thing to do, especially to connect with other people who do it.
Absolutely. Yeah, you may pick it back up after you graduate, which is very, very soon. You're graduating supposedly this early fall or summer. And in your PhD in biology. That's a huge accomplishment. But speaking of biology, the other hobby that you have is herpetology, right?
Yeah, well, so you're still in southeastern Louisiana, and I maybe will be able to return to our homeland. But the great thing about Southern Louisiana is you got so many herps down there. You got so many frogs and salamanders and snakes. They're just all over the place because it's what a great swampy environment you have. And I love going out and just looking for frogs or snakes and trying to grab them. I mean, it's just fun. So obviously frogs are very safe. We don't got any
Well,
poison dart frogs.
it depends on if you're in the Amazon or not.
Yeah. If you're in Amazon, don't touch anything that's vibrant or colorful.
Which you were
don't touch
in the
anything
Amazon.
if you're in the Amazon. Yeah. But in Louisiana, other than you have, I think 6 venomous snakes in Louisiana. I don't think they're particularly hard to identify. Honestly, I think the hardest one is the water moccasin. So just, if you're gonna grab snakes, you should know at least which ones are dangerous, what they look like, and if you're not sure, you don't grab it. But there's way more safe snakes than dangerous ones, and they're a lot of fun to chase down and grab.
I don't grab them. I shoot them.
No,
snake. I kill them with a shovel.
What would you rather see in your house? A snake or a mouse?
A snake. I mean,
you'd rather see? No. I like your first answer. Look, if we kill,
I don't know why I said that. I meant the opposite.
Here's the problem: you can have a cute little garden snake, and he's just a little green snake, and he's just kind of hanging out. And then they don't usually get inside either. That's the problem. Mice get inside much easier than snakes do. I've never seen a snake inside. I did have a mouse, which I couldn't find. It died. It smelled bad for like a week because it was just died in my walls. And there's nothing you can do about that.
No, there's nothing.
There's nothing to do about that. So I'd much rather a little garden snake in my lawn eat the mice so they can't get inside of my home and keep me safe. Because chances are, if you've seen a snake, it's probably a safe one. Again, other than a couple of venomous ones, I understand why if you see like a water moccasin, you might be more concerned.
Out back my house where the lake is, like I have plenty of water moccasins out there.
But that's even the thing. Those snakes are usually a lot less. They're much more defensive. For example, the reason why they're called cottonmouths, right, is because when they gape, they have that bright white mouth, and that's their innate mechanism. So a cottonmouth, I've heard stories of people getting chased in the water by a water moccasin.
That would be terrifying.
I'm a little skeptical, and not that I'm sure that they saw one and started quickly running away or swimming away. But the thing is, it's the snake is not going to chase you down and bite you. That doesn't really benefit it. So usually it has a nest or something or a territory it's defending, and their natural mechanism is to coil up and then gape. So they show you that bright white mouth, hey, don't come any closer because this is where I draw the line. And so it's not, to me, that's not a threat, because if I saw a snake that I thought was dangerous and it coiled up and showed me its mouth, I'd be like, okay, this is your space.
Yeah, well, I think that sometimes with tall grass or something on a bank or whatever, people could accidentally step on it and then
that's
they
the
bite.
Biggest concern. Yeah, if you accidentally step on it, that's definitely.
So I'm actually this is just me being curious. If a cottonmouth were to bite me, how long do I have to get to the hospital? What could I do in the immediate? Suck it out.
Don't bother that. Don't pee on it. Don't try to suck it out. Just go to the hospital. They'll have an anti-venom. Water moccasins are, I think, one of the worst ones. For example, the other end of the spectrum, copperheads are the least venomous. So those are the ones that look like they have Hershey Kisses on them. They're very easy to identify. And I've seen that a few times in nature, actually, which is really fun to get to see one of those. I actually did. I know I was out with a couple of my master's students friends, and he actually did step on a copperhead, but it didn't bite him. So he stepped on it, he looked down, and he realized what was under his foot. I think he was wearing flip-flops too, and he lifted his foot because he was trying to take photographs of a copperhead, and it had some babies around. So he stepped on one of the young ones. He didn't see it, and he lifted his foot and it just ran away. So you don't always get bit either. You should watch where you're stepping. But I caught a snake in my backyard, and it was the coolest thing because I grabbed it, and it had. This is kind of sad. If I had known it had a meal already, I wouldn't have grabbed it because I don't want them to lose that. But it spit up a frog, and I was recording when it did that, and I saw the frog come out, and in the video I kind of jumped because I'm what just came out? What just happened? I don't even know what it was. And then I looked a little bit more, I saw the leg and stuff. I was like, oh my gosh, it had a frog inside of it. So yeah, I love grabbing snakes and I love catching frogs. I'll always grab them. I might take a photo with it and then I let it go. And as long as you know which snakes are dangerous, which ones aren't, you become a lot less afraid of them, and then they can become not only a fun hobby to run out and find them and grab them, flip a log, and you'll probably find some in Louisiana, whether it's a frog or a salamander or a snake.
I don't get it. Like, what's the point of catching them? What do you like to do when you catch them?
It's just, I mean, it's just so fulfilling. It's because also, look, reptiles in general are way safer than mammals. I would never just like grab a squirrel or grab a possum, because if it did bite me, first of all, it's going to hurt way more. I've been bitten by snakes. They don't hurt. Like, they don't feel like anything at all. And if a mammal bites you, they got a lot more teeth and they're a lot sharper. And they're a lot less likely to let go too. And then they carry a lot more disease. I'd be much more worried if I got bit by some kind of mammal, but did I just get rabies? Like, I don't know. Versus a snake bites me, I'm like,
Jason had his pet squirrels and he kept them in his apartment, and then he like named them because he was cutting down trees and the nest fell out of a tree, so he adopted them. And the little squirrel, he'd like leave the little door of the cage open in the other room, and it would climb out in the morning and it would go up into Jason's bed and put its little hand on Jason's like toe. Just like wait there, like wake him up. I guess he was hungry. It was so cute.
Time to nurse.
Yeah, they're adorable.
Those are cute. But a wild squirrel, I'm more scared of than a snake.
Fair enough.
Because if it did bite me, that's much worse.
So what, like, long term, if you like delved back into your herpetology hobby after you graduated, where would you want to go ideally? What would you want to study and why?
Yeah, so right now I'm actually looking at just going to teaching full time, because that is my favorite part of the job, and I'm tired of like the bench work and the lab work. It's really cool to be able to talk about research. It's less cool for me to do the research. It's not where I enjoy it. So I'm thinking for my next job will probably be either a full-time lecturer. That's probably first, maybe a professor position at a small college or university, but probably a full-time lecturer first and work my way up. But definitely a teaching focused job. And then I can still just go out and look for snakes and stuff for fun. And maybe down the road that will lead to a more ecological or organismal research project and less like the cell and health work. I'm just kind of tired of the small things. I want to just kind of play with animals and have an excuse to look at them or whatever.
So would you want to take a trip back to the Amazon if you had a choice, or would you just avoid that altogether because everything's out to like kill you there?
I mean, the Amazon was really fun and exciting. Went for a biodiversity field trip in my master's program. We spent 5 days in the Amazon and 5 days in the Galapagos, and it was a great experience. I don't know that I need to go back. Like, I could also go to somewhere like Costa Rica and see a lot of cool stuff too.
What are you looking for there?
Honestly, they have very similar ecosystems to the Amazon rainforest. But yeah, you could. So when I was in the Amazon, I didn't really get to see much of the canopy. That's like so much of the life there lives in the canopy of the trees rather than on the forest floor. And I think in Costa Rica, it's maybe easier to be able to go on like a tour of the canopy and see a lot of the wildlife that lives up there. And I think that would be really exciting to see a different part of. I've been in an ecosystem like that, but in a different part of it. So I could kind of see more of it and get a better idea of that whole universe that lives there. That's just so different from what we have out here.
Yeah, I love that. That's so cool, John.
I'm more inclined to go to a new place rather than like the same place to learn, maybe more finer details. I like broader picture stuff.
Yeah, I just know for me, I would never, you'd have to literally pay me to go to the Amazon. There's nothing in me that desires to go.
I paid a lot to go to the Amazon.
I did, but so
but
scary.
It was, I mean, it's such a unique experience.
Yeah, you came back with a blow dart gun,
That's right. Yeah.
There is a misconception of where the poison comes from for this, isn't it? It's not from the frogs, it's from the tree sap, right?
I don't know. I've not heard
That's what you told me.
I told you that?
Yeah, because you said the frogs eat something from the trees that's like has the poison in it.
So the frogs do produce poison from their diet, which is why you can have pet poison tree frogs and not be poisonous. I thought it was like a certain insect they ate, but now I don't even remember.
Oh, okay,
that's a problem. I learn stuff, I tell people, and then I forget. So
fine, we'll have to link that too, just out of curiosity. But like everything is out to kill you. I have no desire to go there. Give me a resort on the beach.
I don't know if everything's out to kill you. I just think a lot of things could kill you. You just shouldn't mess with them. So that's why it's like, don't touch any trees, don't step any long grass, watch every step you take, and then you're fine. Right. You just have to
don't cross this river where there's a sign. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't want to go into the water without a boat. That'd be scary. we were like hanging out in hammocks once, and there's a snake like in our area, but we were all up in hammocks, so we're like, we're fine. And then
Well, you're
our
fine because you like
professor,
to catch them. So
well, I don't know those snakes, so I wouldn't touch them. Our professor was a little more wild. He did go up and grab it, and we were like, "Oh, is this one safe?" He's like, "I don't know," and we're like, "That's not what you're supposed to do here."
how far away is the hospital?
Yeah,
Can we drag him in
a
the
few
hammock?
100 miles over. Yeah, so
That's
somewhere
great.
Boulder, but yeah.
Oh man, Jon, you're a hoot. You're a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jen. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it, and I look forward to posting this episode, and we'll see what happens. It should be interesting.
Yeah, and I guess you said there's gonna be some links. You can also link my email, and if anyone has specific questions on vaping, even if there's some details that I forgot in the moment, if someone emails me, I can go and look at the literature for them and give them some resources. Like maybe the heavy metal stuff. They're like, oh, I'm concerned about that. I can go and find them some good research and review papers that talk just about maybe the one detail that was mentioned today that they're more interested in, and help them figure out some of those questions they might have.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you so much, Jon. I appreciate your time. And I'm going to let you get back to the lab and to your research.
Yeah, plenty of work to do.
All right, well, have a good day. Thank you for coming on.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Jen.
All right, bye.